Utah holds more slot canyon country than anywhere else on this continent, and the same geology that makes those canyons beautiful is what has been quietly killing people in them for decades. Not the way you'd expect either. Ask most visitors what could go wrong in a narrow sandstone corridor, and they'll say a fall, maybe a flood, if they've done their homework. They will not say a boulder the size of a small car, or a hot spring, or a bridge that has been slowly failing since before Columbus, or a piece of rope that runs out 4 feet short of the ground. Those are on this list too, and they are real, documented, and in most cases fatal. This isn't ranked by body count. A flash flood that kills 7 people and a quicksand pocket that nearly kills one aren't on the same scale, and pretending they are would be dishonest. What orders this list is something narrower and, I'd argue, more useful. The gap between the moment someone makes the choice that kills them and the moment they'd be able to recognize it as the wrong one. Some of these canyons hand you an obvious warning and enough time to act on it. Others don't. The ones near the bottom of this list announce themselves. The ones near the top look, right up until the last several seconds, exactly like a normal day outdoors. 20 canyons. 20 documented incidents, mostly from National Park Service reports, county sheriff statements, and the Utah Avalanche Center's own accident database, not campfire stories. Some of these hikers walked away. A few of them didn't. All of them changed how the agencies that manage these places talk about the danger. And by the end, you'll understand why a park ranger will tell you, without hesitating, that the deadliest thing in a Utah canyon is rarely the thing a first-time visitor is afraid of. Most of what follows comes from National Park Service incident releases, county sheriff statements, and the Utah Avalanche Center's public accident database, cross-checked where more than one agency or outlet covered the same event. A handful of details, names withheld by the reporting agency, an exact cause investigators couldn't fully pin down, get flagged as exactly that, rather than filled in for the sake of a tidier story. That's a deliberate choice. A documentary about real deaths that quietly smooths over its own uncertainty isn't being honest with the people it's describing, and it isn't being honest with you either. We're starting at the bottom of the list, with a threat that doesn't involve a hiker making a bad call at all. It involves nobody being there. 20th on this list is White Canyon, inside Natural Bridges National Monument in San Juan County. 3 enormous stone spans arch over this canyon and its tributary, Armstrong Canyon, cut by intermittent streams over roughly the last 250,000 years. Kachina Bridge is the youngest of the 3, 93 feet thick at its narrowest point, and in June of 1992, a chunk of it came down. Geologists estimate the fallen slab at somewhere around 4,000 tons, dislodged from the underside of the bridge's north face. Nobody was standing beneath it when it let go. Nobody was hurt. The rockfall didn't destroy Kachina Bridge, it enlarged the opening, carving the arch a little closer to whatever its final shape will be before it eventually collapses altogether, the way at least 2 other bridges here already have, leaving only faint traces in the canyon walls. Here's the part that should unsettle you more than a body count would. Owachomo Bridge, the oldest of the 3, has been thinned by rockfall down to about 9 feet at its span. Park geologists describe it plainly as a bridge that may not be standing much longer. Every visitor who walks beneath Owachomo for a photograph is standing under a structure that has been actively failing for centuries, on a timeline nobody can predict within a human lifetime, let alone a single afternoon. The danger here isn't a decision. There's no wrong turn to make, no gear to check, no storm cell to watch for. The rock simply lets go when the rock is ready, and the only real defense is understanding that a stone bridge spanning open air is not a finished object. It is a process you're standing underneath. There's a strange comfort some visitors take from a structure that has already survived thousands of years, as if age were the same thing as stability, when for a natural bridge it's closer to the opposite. Owachomo has thinned precisely because it's old. The erosion that built it has never stopped working, and every year that passes is a year closer to whichever storm, freeze cycle, or ordinary Tuesday afternoon finally removes the last few feet holding it up. Park geologists monitor these formations with periodic surveys and photo comparisons stretching back decades, tracking hairline changes most visitors would never notice. And that quiet, ongoing measurement is really the only warning system in place. Nobody rings a bell before a several hundred-ton piece of a national monument comes down. The bridges don't know they're famous, and they don't slow down for the cameras underneath them. It's worth saying plainly that this canyon killed no one, and that's exactly the point of putting it first. A list built only from fatalities would miss the danger that requires no mistake at all. The one you can't train for, avoid with better gear, or out-hike with a faster pace. Every other entry on this list involves a decision, a piece of equipment, a weather system, something a person did or failed to do. Kachina Bridge did what stone does on a schedule nobody alive gets to see in full. The Hopi and other Puebloan communities with ancestral ties to this stretch of the Colorado Plateau have their own long relationship with these spans, visible in nearby rock art, and in the names the monument itself carries, Kachina among them, drawn from figures central to Hopi religious tradition. That context matters here for a reason beyond respect for the source. Communities who lived within sight of these bridges for centuries never treated them as permanent monuments either. They're geological features that happen to look like architecture, not the other way around, and reading them as something built and finished rather than something still being carved is a distinctly modern misunderstanding, one the rock itself has never shared. Visitors sometimes ask rangers here how long a bridge like Owachomo has left, expecting a number in years, and the honest answer rangers give is closer to a shrug dressed up in geological language. Could be another century. Could be during next spring's runoff. And nobody studying it closely enough to make photo comparisons decade over decade would bet confidently on either extreme. That uncertainty is the actual, honest shape of the answer, not a gap in the science. And it's a harder answer for most visitors to accept than a wrong prediction would be. Natural Bridges was designated Utah's first national monument back in 1908, and it later became the first international dark sky park anywhere on the planet. A title earned by the same isolation that keeps its visitation modest compared to Zion or Arches. Fewer people means fewer eyes on any given rockfall event when it happens, which is a large part of why the exact timing of most of the smaller collapses at this site, unlike the 2019 event at Kachina, is known only approximately, pieced together from occasional visitor photos taken months apart rather than witnessed directly. 19th is Spooky Gulch, a tributary of Dry Fork Coyote Gulch near Escalante, and the geology here creates the opposite kind of danger. Constant, obvious, and still enough to trap you. Spooky Gulch narrows in places to barely wider than a human shoulder, a slot cut so tight that hikers have to turn their bodies sideways and exhale to pass certain sections. It's one of the most photographed canyons in southern Utah for exactly that reason, and it is also one of the more frequent sites for search and rescue calls in Garfield and Kane counties, because the same narrowness that makes the photographs works both ways. Hikers get wedged, not stuck for a minute while they figure out the angle, actually lodged, unable to go forward because the walls pinch tighter ahead, and unable to back out because the return route requires a steep boulder downclimb they can't manage from that position. The Bureau of Land Management and Kane County's volunteer search and rescue ropes team have responded to enough of these calls that in February of 2022, they installed something you won't find at most trailheads anywhere in the country, a physical test post at the entrance to the narrowest sections, so a hiker can check, before committing to the slot, whether their body will actually fit through what's ahead. It sounds almost too simple to be a safety device. It exists because rescuers had pulled enough people out of that gap to know that the test needed to happen before the canyon narrowed, not after. A ropes team extraction from deep inside Spooky Gulch can take the better part of a day. Nobody has died there. The reason nobody has died there is that the terrain gives you a very loud, very immediate signal the second something is wrong. And the corridor is short enough that a rescue, however miserable, is usually still possible. Spooky Gulch and its neighbor Peekaboo Gulch sit close enough together, and are photographed often enough side by side that a lot of visitors treat them as a matched pair with matched difficulty, and that assumption is part of what lands people in trouble. Peekaboo opens with a genuine climbing move up a smooth sandstone face before it narrows. Spooky stays walkable longer before it closes down hard near its midpoint, which means hikers who breeze through the first half often hit the tightest section with their guard already down, mid-canyon, past the easy point of turning back. Search and rescue volunteers in Kane County describe a familiar pattern in their call logs. Larger hikers, often traveling with smaller companions who cleared the gap without issue, assuming the passage will simply give the way it has for everyone else in the group. The test posts installed at the trailhead exist because officials concluded that education alone wasn't closing that gap fast enough, and there's something honest about a fix that doesn't try to talk anyone out of the hike. It just gives them better information before the canyon takes the decision out of their hands. That's a smaller, quieter kind of intervention than a rescue helicopter. And it's arguably done more to keep people out of this particular canyon's grip than anything printed on a trailhead sign ever managed alone. There's an honest tension in how the agency talks about canyons like this one publicly. The agency wants visitors to come. Recreation fees and tourism dollars fund a meaningful share of the very rangers and rescue infrastructure that keep the area running. It also wants those visitors to leave with an accurate sense of what they're walking into, and a website photo of two hikers laughing sideways through a glowing orange slot doesn't communicate the version of the canyon that sometimes needs a ropes team and a 4-hour extraction. Both versions are true at once. Most visits to Spooky Gulch end exactly the way the photographs promise. A smaller, steady fraction end with a radio call to Kanab. What's changed most in the years since those extraction calls became routine isn't the canyon. It's the expectation hikers carry into it. Trip reports and guidebooks now describe Spooky Gulch's tightest section in specific, almost clinical measurements: shoulder width, chest depth, rather than the vaguer, more romantic language earlier guides used. And that shift toward blunt, unglamorous specificity has done more for visitor safety here than any warning sign phrased to sound alarming ever managed. A number a hiker can measure themselves against beats an adjective every time. Body size isn't the only variable rescuers watch for either. Backpacks are a common, underrated culprit. Hikers who correctly judge their own shoulders will clear a gap, forget that a fully loaded pack adds several more inches of width they haven't accounted for, and a growing number of trip reports now specifically recommend passing bags through separately, hand to hand, rather than wearing them through the tightest sections. It's a small procedural fix for a problem that owes nothing to fitness or experience, and everything to simple geometry most hikers never think to measure until the canyon measures it for them. 18th is American Fork Canyon, up in the Wasatch Range. And this one is about a kind of ground that looks solid and isn't. In September of 2022, 45-year-old Thomas Raw of Alpine was hiking in the canyon when he sent a text asking a friend for a ride from the canyon's mouth. He never made that pickup. Search teams found his body the next day in a ravine off the trail. Investigators couldn't determine the exact sequence of what happened in his final minutes, but the working conclusion, based on the terrain and his position, was that he lost his footing on a steep, loose slope and fell several hundred feet before coming to rest. That word loose is doing a lot of work in that sentence, and it's worth understanding why. Much of American Fork Canyon sits on a mix of limestone and looser sedimentary material, broken up by centuries of freeze and thaw into scree fields and crumbling ledges that hold a hiker's weight until, without any particular warning, they don't. Unlike a rockfall event where a hiker below has effectively no say in the outcome, a scree slope failure usually starts with the hiker's own body weight as the trigger. The slope looks stable enough to cross. It has probably held plenty of other hikers before. That's the trap. A surface that has held for the last 20 people to walk it offers no information at all about whether it will hold for the 21st, and there's rarely a visible line between the safe section and the one that gives way. American Fork Canyon carries a strange double identity that shapes how search and rescue teams think about it. Officially, it's tame enough to host a paved scenic drive, a show cave, and enough family day hikes that most Utah County residents have visited without ever thinking of it as dangerous terrain. Unofficially, its steep, broken slopes above the main corridor generate steady annual call volume for search and rescue teams, rock climbers, canyoneers, and hikers who wandered off the maintained trail onto ground that looks, from below, like a reasonable shortcut. Raw's death sits inside a steady, ongoing count that rarely makes news outside the week it happens, one entry among many rather than an unusual outlier. It fits a pattern rescue coordinators know well: a solo hiker, competent enough by ordinary standards, moving through terrain that the canyon's easy reputation had quietly underprepared him to read. That reputation is worth pausing on, because it's doing real damage across the entire state, not just here. A canyon with a paved road through it, gift shops at the mouth, and a steady flow of casual tourists doesn't feel like the kind of place that kills people, and most of the time it isn't. But the geology underfoot doesn't consult the parking lot for guidance. The same limestone and loose sedimentary rock that makes American Fork Canyon scenic also makes its steep off-trail slopes some of the least forgiving terrain in the range. And the disconnect between how a place looks from the road and what it's actually made of is, on its own, a kind of danger every canyon on this list shares to some degree. Search teams in Utah County log a disproportionate number of their annual calls in this one canyon, more than in far more remote drainages elsewhere in the county. A statistic that has less to do with American Fork being unusually dangerous terrain and more to do with sheer visitation numbers. A canyon, a short drive from a major population center, draws far more people willing to wander a little past the marked trail than a canyon that requires a full day's approach just to reach the trailhead. There's a broader point worth drawing out of American Fork Canyon specifically, because it applies to more than half the canyons on this list. Proximity to a city doesn't buy safety. It just changes who shows up and how prepared they tend to be when they do. A hiker heading into the Maze District of Canyonlands, where the approach roads alone take the better part of a day, almost certainly did real trip planning first, because the terrain demands it before you can even reach the trailhead. A hiker parking along the American Fork Canyon Road on a Saturday morning can be on loose, unstable ground within 20 minutes of leaving the car, often with a fraction of that same planning behind them. Utah County Search and Rescue has in recent years started posting seasonal reminders specifically naming American Fork Canyon by name, rather than issuing only generic backcountry advisories. A shift in communication strategy that reflects a broader lesson repeated across several entries on this list. A warning aimed at everywhere in general tends to land nowhere in particular. Naming the specific slope, the specific pullout, the specific trailhead where past incidents concentrated gives a hiker something concrete to weigh against their own plans, rather than an abstract caution easy to file away as advice meant for someone less careful than themselves. 17th is Courthouse Wash, inside Arches National Park, and this incident is recent enough that most of the reporting on it is barely months old. In December of 2025, 33-year-old Austin Dirks, an experienced backpacker hiking a stretch of the Haidaki Trail, stepped onto ground that looked like ordinary dry wash bottom and sank to his knee in a heartbeat, into mud that behaved, in his own description afterward, like wet concrete. Air temperatures that week were sitting around 20 degrees Fahrenheit. He was alone. And he was stuck at roughly a 45-degree angle, unable to work his leg free for close to 2 hours before a search and rescue drone happened to spot him. Quicksand in the popular imagination is a swamp thing, something out of an old adventure film, and that reputation has done real damage. because it convinced most hikers the danger isn't worth taking seriously in a place as dry as Utah's canyon country. What actually happens is more mundane, and if anything, more dangerous, precisely because it's mundane. A layer of fine sediment sits saturated with water just beneath a dry, sun-baked crust, and the crust holds body weight for exactly as long as it takes to break through it. Once a leg sinks into saturated sand under suction, pulling it back out creates a vacuum that can require several 100 pounds of force, more than a person can generate on their own, especially braced at an angle in freezing air. Rangers used shovels, a ladder, and traction boards to free Dirks, then worked to re-warm his leg before evacuating him. He survived because someone happened to be flying a drone in the area that afternoon. That is not a safety plan. It's luck wearing the shape of one. Quicksand's reputation problem runs both directions, and it's worth untangling. Hollywood oversold it for decades as a hazard that could swallow a grown adult whole in seconds, which is essentially never how it behaves in the real world. And the National Park Service has spent years quietly correcting that myth in visitor safety materials. But the correction seems to have overshot because plenty of experienced desert hikers now treat the whole category as a joke, a punchline about movies from their childhood, rather than a documented, ongoing cause of search and rescue calls across the Colorado Plateau. Neither version of the story is the useful one. Quicksand rarely kills through drowning. It kills, or nearly kills, through entrapment combined with exposure, cold, heat, or simple time spent stuck and unable to summon help. Exactly the combination that came within a stroke of luck of ending differently for Dirks. Arches Rangers have started flagging Courthouse Wash specifically in seasonal advisories after wet weather. Not because the wash is unusual among the park's washes, but because its accessibility from the main road brings a volume of casual foot traffic that more remote wash bottoms simply don't see. A hazard that would draw little attention in a backcountry canyon 3 days from a trailhead becomes a real safety statistic when it sits a short walk from a parking lot. I'll say plainly what a lot of trip reports dance around. Dirks did close to everything right and still ended up trapped to the knee in freezing mud for 2 hours. He was experienced, he was equipped for a multi-day route, and he still couldn't have predicted, from the surface, which specific patch of ground would fail under him. That's an uncomfortable thing to admit about a landscape people are actively encouraged to explore. And it's exactly why Rangers keep repeating it. Instead of letting the story fade into a punchline about quicksand, nobody takes seriously anymore. Recovery from an incident like this one, physically, tends to be straightforward once a person is freed. A cold leg, some bruising, maybe mild frostbite depending on exposure time. The lingering effect is more psychological than physical for most survivors, an altered relationship with dry-looking ground that never fully resets, a habit of testing a wash bottom with a trekking pole before committing full weight to it, carried forward into canyons that never posed any comparable risk at all. Fear, once it's earned honestly, doesn't always know where its jurisdiction ends. Arches sees roughly 1.5 million visitors most years, a huge share of them on short, easy walks to the park's namesake formations, which means a hazard that can pull a hiker to the knee in freezing mud. Sitting inside a wash, a short detour from the main road, catches a very different population than a hazard buried deep in a permit-only wilderness area would. The park's approach has been to concentrate its clearest warnings at exactly those accessible pressure points, rather than blanket every trail equally, on the theory that a visitor who is already committed to a serious backcountry route is more likely to have done their own homework than someone drawn a few hundred yards off a paved pullout by a pretty wash bottom. 16th is Diamond Fork Canyon, southeast of Spanish Fork, home to the Fifth Water Hot Springs, a chain of mineral pools that draw thousands of hikers a year on a moderate 2.5-mile trail. Most of those visits end with nothing worse than a sunburn. In April of 2023, 42-year-old Devin Twett was found unresponsive in the pools and pronounced dead at the scene. In a separate incident several years earlier, in January of 2019, a 35-year-old woman was seriously injured at the same springs. The Park Service's own advisory for the site states the source water reaches roughly 111 degrees Fahrenheit, where it emerges from the ground hot enough to cause immediate burns, and warns visitors specifically not to enter the water where it feeds into the top of the pool system. What makes a hot spring dangerous isn't obvious the way a cliff edge is. Geothermal water in Diamond Fork Canyon rises through fractured limestone, picking up dissolved minerals along the way. And those minerals deposit as smooth, slick travertine on the pool floors and ledges, a surface that stays wet, uneven, and nearly frictionless in exactly the spots where people are climbing between pools. The temperature itself isn't constant either. Pools lower in the chain, diluted by cooler creek water, sit at a comfortable soak. Pools closer to the source can be scalding, and the difference between the two isn't always visible from the surface. A slip on wet travertine into the wrong pool, or simple submersion for too long in warmer water than a swimmer realizes, converts a postcard hot spring into a medical emergency with no warning beyond the water itself. Fifth Water's popularity is itself part of the risk profile here, in a way that sets it apart from almost everything else on this list. Most of these canyons are dangerous partly because they're remote, technical, or unforgiving enough to filter out casual visitors before the real hazard ever comes into play. Fifth Water filters almost nobody. It's a 2.5-mile trail to a chain of mineral blue pools terraced in travertine, reachable by families, first-time hikers, and tourists in sandals, which means the population exposed to a scalding source pool or a slick travertine ledge is, on any given weekend, enormous and largely untrained in reading either hazard. A canyon that demands technical skill mostly injures people who have some. A trail that demands almost nothing draws a crowd with no particular reason to expect danger at all. The Uinta Wasatch Cache National Forest, which manages the site, has leaned into signage and clearly marked boundaries around the hottest source pools rather than restricting access outright, a trade-off that keeps the springs open to the public while putting the responsibility for reading the warnings squarely on each visitor. It mostly works. The pools that draw thousands of visitors a year produce, most weekends, nothing worse than a good soak and a long walk back to the car. The exceptions are rare enough to make the local news when they happen, which is exactly why they're easy to forget are possible at all. There's something almost paradoxical about a landscape built entirely from extremes: bone-dry canyons, flash floods, cliffs, cold nights, producing one of its more serious hazards from water that's too warm rather than too cold. Utah's geothermal features exist because the same tectonic forces that lifted and fractured the Colorado Plateau also created deep pathways for green groundwater to circulate near residual heat sources underground, then return to the surface carrying that heat with it. It's the same broad geologic story that shaped every canyon on this list, water moving through rock over immense stretches of time, just expressed here as a hot spring instead of a slot. Compare Fifth Water to a slot canyon flood for a moment, because the contrast says something about how differently the same underlying force, water moving through fractured rock, can present itself to a hiker standing at the surface. A flash flood announces danger through violence, noise, a visible wall of debris-laden water arriving fast enough to see coming, at least in principle. A hot spring announces almost nothing. The water sits still, clear, inviting. Exactly the presentation that convinces a tired hiker on a hot afternoon to climb one ledge higher than the marked boundary, toward water that looks identical to the safe pool below it and isn't. Fifth Water isn't Utah's only geothermal hotspot either, just its most heavily visited. Mystic Hot Springs near Monroe and the more remote Meadow Hot Springs further south draw smaller, steadier crowds with comparable source temperatures and comparable travertine hazards, and safety advisories at all three sites now use nearly identical language, warning visitors specifically against entering water where it emerges from the ground, rather than issuing a single blanket temperature warning for the whole system. That specificity exists because a generic hot spring warning undersells exactly how narrow the 111-degree danger zone actually is, a few feet of source water inside pools that are, everywhere else, perfectly pleasant to sit in. 15th is Death Hollow, part of the Box Death Hollow Wilderness near Escalante, a long, technical canyon known for stretches where hikers have no option but to swim. In late May of 2019, 4 women in their 40s and 50s entered the canyon unprepared for how cold and how long those swimming sections actually run. Cold, set, and fast. By that Sunday night, at least one member of the group was hypothermic enough that they activated a satellite emergency beacon rather than continue. Garfield County Search and Rescue reached them early the next morning and extracted the group. Nobody died. Officials described them afterward simply as frightened but unharmed. Hypothermia doesn't require a blizzard, and that's the part hikers underestimate about a canyon like Death Hollow. Water in these shaded, spring-fed pools rarely climbs out of the 50s even in summer, and prolonged immersion pulls heat out of a human body roughly 25 times faster than air of the same temperature. A hiker can start a swim feeling only mildly uncomfortable and, within a stretch of pools that might take 40 minutes to clear, lose enough core temperature to become confused, clumsy, and unable to make good decisions about their own safety, all without ever feeling a moment of specific alarm along the way. The 4 women in this case did the one thing that reliably beats that decline. They recognized the trend early enough to call for help before their judgment went with their body heat. What makes this rescue worth including alongside the fatal entries on this list is the decision the group made at the point where things started going wrong, because it runs against a very common instinct in the outdoors. Turning back or stopping and calling for help reads to a lot of hikers as an admission of failure, especially on a route they've researched, planned for, and told friends they'd complete. Garfield County's search and rescue coordinators have pushed back on that framing for years in public comments about incidents like this one. A satellite beacon activated early, while a group can still think clearly and communicate their location accurately, is a far better outcome for everyone involved, rescuers included, than one activated after hypothermia has already set in, and confusion has scrambled the group's ability to describe where they are. Box Death Hollow earned its wilderness designation partly because of terrain like this: long, shaded, water-carved passages where a hiker commits to a swim without a reliable way to judge, from the entry point, how many more of them lie ahead. The canyon doesn't announce its total cold water mileage up front. It reveals it one pool at a time. And by the point, a hiker has a clear sense of how much swimming the day actually requires. They're often already partway through it, wet, and losing heat. The rise of satellite messengers over the past decade has quietly changed the math on incidents like this one, in a way that's easy to take for granted now. A decade earlier, a group in this exact position, hypothermic and deep inside a wilderness area with no cell signal for miles, would have had to send someone hiking out on foot to raise the alarm. The same desperate option Hosobuchi's wife faced at the subway and the Zion Narrow's husband faced years later. A beacon that transmits a precise location to a monitoring center in seconds, rather than requiring hours of additional exposure to physically reach help, is arguably the single biggest advance in backcountry survival odds this entire list has seen, and it shows up, directly or by its absence, in more of these 20 stories than almost any other factor. Garfield County covers a huge, sparsely populated stretch of southern Utah with a volunteer search and rescue team stretched across more than 5,000 square miles, which means response time for an incident deep in Box Death Hollow can run to several hours even after a beacon signal comes through clean and precise. The four women in this story didn't need an instant rescue. They needed enough warning to stop losing heat before the point of no return. And a beacon bought them exactly that. Time to hunker down, conserve what warmth they had left, and wait out a response that, however long it took to physically arrive, was already on its way the moment they pressed the button. Older rescue models built around someone hiking out for help simply don't offer that same early window. Cold water swims like the ones in Death Hollow have also pushed a quiet shift in what canyoneers now carry as standard kit. Lightweight, packable wetsuit tops that add almost no weight to a pack, but change the entire risk profile of a route, with mandatory swimming sections. It's not glamorous gear, and it wasn't universal even a decade ago among hikers who considered themselves experienced. Incidents like this one, retold often enough in trip planning circles and gear reviews, have done more to normalize carrying it than any single safety bulletin managed on its own. 14th is the stretch of Zion Canyon's scenic drive near Big Bend, and this is the one entry on this list where nobody was hiking anywhere near a trail when the danger arrived. In November of 2023, a slab of Navajo sandstone, roughly 20 by 30 feet, more than 430 feet above the roadway, broke free and came down onto the scenic drive. Rangers closed the road and evacuated the area. Nobody was struck. The Park Service's own account points to a combination of causes: plant roots wedging into existing fractures in the rock over years, and the kind of daily heating and cooling that expands and contracts sandstone until a crack that has existed for decades finally completes itself. This is the canyon entry that best demonstrates why rangers, not hikers, sit at the center of the story. Nobody made a bad call in this incident. There was no trail to misjudge and no gear to check. The people who mattered here were the ones who read a geological report, closed a road on short notice, and got visitors out of a footprint that a several-ton slab of rock was about to occupy, based on nothing more than a judgment call about risk that most tourists driving the scenic drive that morning never even knew was being made on their behalf. Rockslide risk in Zion Canyon isn't hypothetical or rare. The same stretch of cliff has shed material more than once since. It's simply invisible until the day it isn't, which is precisely why it falls to the people paid to watch it, not the people passing beneath it. Root wedging sounds like a minor contributor until you see the timeline involved. A seed lodges in a hairline fracture on a sandstone cliff face, germinates on whatever moisture collects there, and over years, sometimes decades, the growing root system exerts slow, continuous outward pressure, exactly like a wedge, driven by hand. Except this wedge never stops pushing and never gets tired. Combine that with Zion's daily temperature swings, which can exceed 40 degrees between a summer afternoon and the pre-dawn hours, and sandstone expands and contracts on a cycle that, repeated across enough seasons, turns a hairline crack into a fault line waiting for a trigger as ordinary as an unusually hot week. The Big Bend slab wasn't a one-time event for that stretch of cliff either. The same general area has produced additional rockfall since, and that repetition is exactly why the park now treats certain cliff faces along the scenic drive as monitored zones rather than fixed backdrops, tracked the way a structural engineer might watch a bridge under known stress, rather than assumed stable simply because it's been standing since before anyone currently alive was born. Zion Canyon's scenic drive carries private vehicle traffic only part of the year. For most of it, visitors ride mandatory shuttle buses along the exact route this slab came down on, a detail that shaped how seriously the park treated the closure. A shuttle carries far more people per trip than private cars ever did, packed on a fixed, predictable schedule along a corridor with cliffs on one side for its entire length, which means a rock slide risk assessment here isn't just about the odds of a given rock falling. It's about how many people are likely to be directly beneath that exact stretch of road at any given moment. That calculation, more than the geology alone, is why rangers erred toward closing the road quickly rather than waiting for further confirmation the slope had stabilized. Compare that math to a stretch of undeveloped backcountry cliff with the same rockfall probability and effectively zero visitors passing beneath it in a given hour. And you can see why Zion invests disproportionate monitoring resources into a small handful of high-traffic corridors rather than spreading equal attention across every cliff face inside the park's roughly 150,000 acres. Risk, in a practical safety sense, is the rock multiplied by how many people are standing underneath it at any given moment. Never just a property of the rock alone, and Big Bend, sitting directly beneath one of the busiest transit corridors in the park, scores high on that second half of the equation, no matter how the geology itself behaves. The scenic drive reopened within days, once engineers confirmed the immediate slope had settled, a turnaround park staff described as fast by the standards of a major geologic hazard response, made possible mostly because Zion already had a monitoring protocol in place before this event, rather than having to build one from scratch afterward. That's the quieter half of this story. The emergency response worked roughly as designed, closing fast, assessing carefully, reopening once the specific hazard had been evaluated, rather than defaulting to the more cautious, more disruptive option of an extended closure out of general uncertainty. 13th is Weeping Rock, a short, heavily trafficked trail inside Zion Canyon itself. And this entry belongs on the list for the opposite reason Big Bend does. Here, hikers were standing directly underneath it. In August of 2019, a substantial block sheared off Cable Mountain roughly 3,000 feet above the shuttle stop and came down through the canyon, showering the trail and road below with rock, branches, dust, and sand. 3 people were hurt, one badly enough to need hospital transport. Shuttle service through the area was suspended for about 90 minutes while rangers confirmed the slope had stabilized. Cable Mountain rises in a series of near-vertical Navajo sandstone cliffs, cross-bedded from ancient wind-blown dunes, and cut through by joints and fractures invisible from the canyon floor, 3,000 feet below. A rockfall event at that scale gives no meaningful warning. No rumble builds gradually. No crack widens visibly for days beforehand from a hiker's vantage point at the bottom. It simply lets go, and gravity does the rest of the work across a fall long enough to turn a block of stone into something closer to an artillery shell by the time it reaches the canyon floor. Zion's own geologic hazard maps mark Weeping Rock and several similar amphitheaters as recurring rockfall sites, not one-time anomalies. That's the quiet reason the trail remains one of the busiest in the park, and one of the few places on this list where standing still, doing nothing wrong, reading the sign, checking the weather, following every rule, still leaves you underneath several thousand feet of cliff that owes you no schedule. Weeping Rock gets its name, and most of its visitors, from something almost gentle by comparison. A hanging garden fed by a spring that seeps out of the cliff face after percolating down through the porous Navajo sandstone above, taking centuries to travel from the plateau's surface to the point where it finally emerges as a curtain of dripping water. That same porous rock, soft enough to hold water and slowly release it, is part of why this stretch of cliff sheds material more readily than harder, denser formations elsewhere in the canyon. The spring that makes the trail beautiful and the fracture pattern that makes it dangerous come from the same rock behaving the same way, just expressed on 2 different time scales, one that takes centuries to produce a trickle of water and one that can produce a boulder in under a second. Zion draws close to 5 million visitors most years, and a large share of them ride the shuttle straight to this stop, making Weeping Rock, by simple volume of foot traffic, one of the more statistically exposed rockfall zones in the entire national park system. The park's response after the 2019 event wasn't to close the trail permanently, it reopened it after engineers assessed the slope, because closing every trail beneath every cliff in Zion Canyon would effectively close the park. The decision instead was to keep watching, which is a less satisfying answer than a guarantee and also the only honest one available. It's worth naming the specific unfairness of this entry compared to nearly everything else on this list. A hiker who enters Buckskin Gulch during a storm forecast, or who skips a stopper knot, or who wanders off a marked trail chasing a better photo, made a choice. A documentary can reasonably walk an audience through step by step. Someone who rides the Zion shuttle to Weeping Rock on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, reads the interpretive signs, stays on the paved path, and gets struck by a piece of Cable Mountain made no choice worth examining at all. If this list has a genuine villain, geology itself is closer to it here than at almost any other stop along the way. Park geologists have mapped rockfall runout zones throughout Zion Canyon, essentially predictive footprints marking how far debris from a given cliff face has traveled historically and is statistically likely to travel again. And some trail segments, benches, and even a handful of historic structures sit inside those mapped zones, simply because the canyon floor is narrow enough that there's nowhere else to reasonably build. Weeping Rock's shuttle stop was relocated slightly and reconfigured after the 2019 event specifically to reduce dwell time in the highest probability portion of that runout zone. A change most visitors riding through today would never notice, engineered entirely around a hazard they can't see and, with any luck, will never personally encounter. Compare that quiet, almost invisible infrastructure work to how differently the public tends to react to a rockfall event versus a flash flood with the same number of casualties, and you notice something worth naming. A flood produces a dramatic, retellable narrative, a wall of water, a countdown, a rescue attempted or failed. A rockfall event like the one at Weeping Rock happened in roughly a second, with no build, no warning, and no story a survivor could meaningfully narrate afterward beyond noise and then dust. Both are real. Only one of them tends to get remembered as a story rather than filed away as a statistic. 12th is the rim country of Bryce Canyon, which isn't a single slot but a network of amphitheaters carved into the edge of the Ponsaugen Plateau. And the danger here has almost nothing to do with the hoodoos everyone photographs. On August 18, 2011, 51-year-old Volker Kuntz, visiting from Germany, was walking the rim trail between Sunrise and Sunset Points when a thunderstorm moved in. He took shelter under a large ponderosa pine. Lightning struck the tree and the current transferred through it into him. He was pronounced dead at the scene. The National Park Service's own release on the incident is unusually direct for an agency that typically avoids second-guessing a visitor's choices. Sheltering under a tall, isolated tree during a lightning storm is one of the most dangerous things a person can do outdoors. The instinct to duck under the nearest tree makes sense on every level except the one that matters. A tree is taller than a person. It's a physical barrier against rain, and it feels like cover. Lightning follows the path of least electrical resistance to the ground, and a tall pine, standing alone at the rim of an 8,000-foot plateau, is frequently that path. Current traveling down the trunk doesn't stay contained inside the wood. It can arc outward through the ground itself, or through anyone standing close enough to the base, a phenomenon investigators call a side flash, or when it travels along wet soil, ground current. Kuntz did nothing reckless by ordinary hiking standards. He sought the most obvious shelter available on an exposed plateau rim during a storm that, by several accounts, built quickly enough to leave little time to reach a building or a car. Bryce sits at high elevation with almost no continuous tree cover to break up a storm cell, and its exposed rim trails put hikers closer to that risk, more often than most other canyon country in the state. Lightning safety advice tends to arrive in a tone that assumes the danger is abstract, distant, something that happens to other people in other places. Kuntz's case is a reminder that the advice exists because the physics are specific and unforgiving. The National Weather Service's own recommendation that a person caught outdoors in a storm should get low, avoid isolated tall objects, and ideally reach a hard-topped vehicle or building sounds almost too simple to be the entire answer. And that simplicity is exactly why it gets ignored under real pressure. Rain is falling, thunder is close, and a wide ponderosa pine 50 feet away looks like the only available option in a landscape with essentially no structures for miles. The gap between what the advice says to do and what actually feels like the safer choice in the moment is where incidents like this one live. Bryce's amphitheaters sit at elevations above 8,000 feet in places, high enough that summer monsoon cells common across the Colorado Plateau build faster and hit harder here than at lower desert elevations nearby, a pattern park rangers reference specifically when briefing hikers headed out onto the rim in July and August. The peak of the region's thunderstorm season. Lightning fatalities across the national park system cluster overwhelmingly around exposed rims, summits, and open plateaus rather than inside deep-walled canyons, which sounds counterintuitive on a list built around canyon danger until you think through the physics. A hiker standing at the bottom of a narrow slot is, electrically, one of the safer places a person can be during a storm, shielded on both sides by rock walls taller than any nearby object a strike would prefer. It's the transition zones, rims, approach trails, viewpoints exactly like the one Kunz was walking, where canyon country's open, elevated edges expose a hiker to the sky in a way the canyons themselves rarely do. Utah as a whole sits inside a genuine lightning corridor during monsoon season, June through September, when moisture pulled up from the Gulf of California and the Gulf of Mexico collides with the hot, rising air over the Colorado Plateau and builds thunderstorm cells with startling speed, sometimes going from clear sky to lightning within 30 or 40 minutes. That speed catches out-of-state visitors more often than locals, who've generally learned through repetition to treat a darkening horizon in July as a non-negotiable cue to get off any exposed rim, rather than a photogenic backdrop worth lingering for one more shot. The 30-30 rule: count 30 seconds or fewer between seeing lightning and hearing its thunder, then wait a full 30 minutes after the last strike before returning outside. Gets taught constantly and followed inconsistently, mostly because it demands giving up 30 minutes of a trip a visitor may have traveled a long way and planned around carefully. Kunz's storm, by most accounts, built quickly enough that the standard rule of thumb may have offered him only a narrow window to act on it at all, which is less a criticism of the guidance than a reminder that even correct advice has a shorter shelf life on an exposed plateau rim than it does almost anywhere else on this list. 11th is the Syncline Loop, a demanding 9-mile trail that drops into the canyon country below Island in the Sky, in Canyonlands National Park, and this incident braids two hazards together in a way that made it especially hard to survive. On July 12, 2024, 52-year-old Albino Herrera Espinoza and his 23-year-old daughter, Beatrice, set out on the loop as temperatures climbed past 100 degrees Fahrenheit. At some point on the trail, they lost the route. A text reached emergency dispatchers describing the two as lost and out of water. Search teams, aided by a helicopter, located them that evening. Both were dead by the time rescuers reached them. Investigators attributed the deaths to a combination of heat exhaustion and disorientation. And the pairing matters, because each of those problems makes the other one worse. Heat stress degrades judgment well before it becomes a medical emergency in its own right. A hiker who's overheated and dehydrated makes navigation mistakes a well-hydrated, cool hiker in the same terrain generally wouldn't. Those mistakes lengthen the time spent exposed to the heat, which degrades judgment further, in a feedback loop that can close in on someone in a matter of hours rather than days. The Syncline Loop drops through slick rock and canyon terrain with few reliable landmarks and almost no shade for most of its length. Exactly the kind of ground where a wrong turn doesn't announce itself as a wrong turn. It just looks like more of the same trail, until the water runs out. Canyonlands rangers describe a particular kind of miscalculation that shows up again and again in incident reports from Island in the Sky, one that has less to do with fitness and more to do with how people plan for heat in the first place. Hikers routinely calculate water needs based on a route's listed distance and their own hiking pace under normal conditions, then fail to account for how much that pace slows and how much more water the body demands once air temperature climbs past the mid-90s. A 9-mile loop planned around a 4-hour pace can stretch to 6 or 7 hours once heat has set in, at exactly the moment the water carried for a 4-hour hike is running out and the day's heat is still climbing toward its afternoon peak. The elder Herrera and his daughter carried water when they started. What the investigation into their deaths points to isn't recklessness so much as a miscalculation, common enough that park rangers now specifically flag it in pre-hike safety talks, treating a trail's mileage rather than the conditions a hiker will actually be moving through as the number that should drive how much water to carry. Canyonlands splits into 3 districts: Island in the Sky, the Needles, and the Maze, separated by the Green and Colorado rivers, and different enough in character that experienced visitors sometimes treat familiarity with one as familiarity with the park as a whole. It usually isn't. Island in the Sky sits on a broad, relatively accessible mesa with paved roads to several trailheads, which draws a more casual crowd than the Needles or the deliberately difficult-to-reach Maze District. And that accessibility is precisely why heat incidents cluster here, more than in the park's more remote, self-selecting terrain. The trail is easy to reach. The heat waiting at the bottom of it is not correspondingly easier to survive. Search and rescue coordinators across the Colorado Plateau now push a specific, deliberately blunt piece of advice in response to incidents like this one. Hike the return leg of any exposed summer route by mid-morning. Not because afternoon heat in the desert is dangerous in some abstract sense, but because a hiker's own judgment is one of the first things heat stress degrades, well before cramping, nausea, or collapse make the danger obvious. By the time the body is sending unmistakable signals, the mind evaluating those signals has often already been compromised for the better part of an hour, which is precisely the window investigators believe closed in on the Herreras that afternoon. Canyonlands rangers now distribute laminated cards at several trailheads listing heat illness symptoms in the specific order they tend to appear: thirst, fatigue, and mild confusion first, nausea and stumbling later, precisely because the earliest symptoms are the easiest for a hiker to dismiss as ordinary tiredness rather than a medical warning worth acting on immediately. By the time a hiker or their companions recognize something is seriously wrong, using symptoms most people associate with heat illness, stumbling, vomiting, disorientation severe enough to be obvious to a bystander, the physiological damage is often already substantially further along than the visible signs alone would suggest. 10th is the Silver Fork drainage in Big Cottonwood Canyon on Davenport Hill. And this one is a winter entry, an avalanche, not a flood. On the morning of December 31st, 2024, 54-year-old Reed Heil, splitboarding alone, dropped into a north-facing slope on Davenport Hill. The snowpack failed on a weak, faceted layer buried near its base, a layer that had formed weeks earlier during a dry, cold spell and never bonded properly to the snow that fell on top of it afterward. The slide carried him and buried him under roughly 20 feet of debris. He was wearing an avalanche transceiver. He was found only because a separate party riding an adjacent Little Cottonwood Canyon noticed a single track leading into a patch of fresh, disturbed snow with no matching track leading back out and called it in. Rescuers reached him and began CPR immediately. He didn't survive. Faceted snow is, structurally, closer to sugar than to the dense, bonded snowpack most people picture when they think of an avalanche slope. It forms when a shallow, cold snow layer sits exposed to a strong temperature gradient with the ground beneath it, a process called kinetic growth metamorphism, and the crystals that result are angular and weakly connected to each other. Bury that layer under new snow and you've built a structural flaw into the mountain itself, one that can persist and fail suddenly, weeks or months after it formed, long after the storm that produced it is forgotten. The Utah Avalanche Center tracks these persistent weak layers specifically because they're statistically responsible for a disproportionate share of the state's avalanche fatalities, and because, unlike a fresh, obviously unstable storm slab, a persistent weak layer gives almost no visible warning on the surface. The slope Heil rode had likely been ridden safely by other people in the days before. That's exactly the kind of terrain a persistent weak layer waits inside. Heil was traveling alone, and the center's own accident reporting treats solo backcountry travel as a factor worth naming explicitly. The travel style didn't cause the slide. It removed every option that depends on a partner. Someone watching from a safe spot who could see where the burial occurred. Someone who could start digging within the first several minutes, when a buried rider's odds of survival are highest, instead of deploying an avalanche transceiver search from scratch. The center's own long-run statistics show survival chances for a fully buried person drop sharply after roughly 15 minutes, driven mostly by suffocation rather than trauma or cold, which means the single most important piece of avalanche safety equipment on a solo tour is a partner who saw where you went in, ahead of a beacon, a shovel, or a probe. Big Cottonwood Canyon and its neighboring drainages sit inside terrain the Utah Avalanche Center forecasts daily through the winter season, specifically because the combination of a continental snowpack, cold temperatures, and infrequent storms creates persistent weak layers here more often than in wetter, more maritime snow climates elsewhere in the country. Utah's snow gets marketed to skiers as some of the lightest, driest powder on Earth. The same qualities that make it feel that way underfoot are largely what make it prone to failing the way it failed under Reed Heil on Davenport Hill. Big and Little Cottonwood Canyons together host some of the most heavily used backcountry ski and snowboard terrain in the country, wedged directly against resort boundaries in a way that makes the transition from managed, avalanche-controlled slopes to uncontrolled backcountry terrain almost seamless underfoot, sometimes marked by nothing more than a single rope line and a sign easy to duck beneath without a second thought. That proximity is a large part of why these two canyons post some of the highest avalanche fatality counts of any drainage in the Wasatch. The terrain itself isn't unusually unstable compared to other ranges in the state. What's different is the sheer number of people choosing to ride it, often just a few dozen yards past a resort boundary that offered no warning their conditions had changed at all. The Utah Avalanche Center publishes a daily forecast for exactly this reason, rating danger by elevation band and aspect across the range each morning through the winter season. And it's one of the more sophisticated public safety tools available to backcountry travelers anywhere in the country. Heil's accident report doesn't suggest he ignored that forecast. Persistent weak layers are notoriously difficult to assess from the surface even for experienced forecast-literate riders, since the layer itself sits buried, invisible, and the terrain above it can look and feel entirely normal, underfoot, right up until it doesn't. A good forecast narrows the odds. It has never claimed to eliminate them. Utah recorded multiple backcountry avalanche fatalities across the Wasatch that same winter season, a pattern the Avalanche Center's director has pointed to repeatedly when discussing persistent weak layers as a statewide multi-year problem rather than a single bad storm cycle. Once a faceted layer establishes itself deep in a snowpack early in the season, it can persist as a hidden structural flaw for months, reactivated by nothing more than additional snow loading on top of it. And that persistence is why forecasters sometimes describe a particularly dangerous winter less by its storms than by what happened quietly. On one cold, clear week back in November, Ninth is Little Cottonwood Canyon, on the climbing route known as the Great White Icicle. And this incident is about a piece of gear left off, not a piece of terrain that failed. On June 3, 2023, a climber was descending the route on a series of 5 rappels with a partner. Deliberately, and for a specific reason. Neither climber had tied a stopper knot at the end of their rope. The pair wanted to avoid the rope snagging and disrupting the natural water flow along the route during the descent. On one of the rappel stations, the lead climber overshot the intended stopping point, sliding past it for reasons investigators couldn't fully reconstruct. Their partner tried to call out a warning. Rushing water along the route drowned out the shout. The climber reached the end of the rope, which had no knot to stop it running through the device, and fell roughly 300 feet. They didn't survive. Search and rescue officials who responded described the pair as a well-prepared, experienced party and used the incident specifically to reinforce a wider safety message. Technical skill and rescue skill aren't the same skill, and a single missing knot can erase the difference between the two in about a second and a half. A stopper knot is one of the smallest pieces of technique in the entire discipline of rope work, and that's exactly what makes this incident impossible to write off as a beginner's mistake. Every other decision this pair made was sound. They were experienced, they had the right gear, they communicated as best the environment allowed. The choice to skip the knot wasn't careless in the ordinary sense. It was a considered trade-off against a real hazard, a snagged rope disrupting flow along a route where the water itself was a factor. From the outside, a rappel with a stopper knot and a rappel without one look identical for the entire length of the descent, right up until the rope runs out under one of them and doesn't under the other. There's no visible difference in the moment. There's only a difference in the last several feet. The Great White Icicle is, under normal circumstances, an ice and mixed rock route, popular enough in winter conditions that it has a well-established reputation among Wasatch climbers, and the rappel descent this incident occurred on is the standard way down for parties who've climbed it. Rope end awareness is the practice of always knowing exactly how much rope remains below a climber during a rappel, whether by tying a stopper knot, counting rope length precisely, or watching for a marked midpoint. Every basic rope work course teaches it early, for one blunt reason. It's one of the more common ways experienced climbers still die on otherwise well-executed descents. The people it catches are rarely novices making an obvious mistake. More often, they're skilled parties making a calculated trade against one hazard, a trade that leaves them exposed to a different one. Search and rescue officials who spoke publicly about this case were careful not to frame it as a story about inexperience, because it plainly wasn't one, and that carefulness matters. A narrative where only careless people die makes for a more comfortable story and a less useful warning. The harder, truer version, the one rescue coordinators actually want climbers to absorb, is that skilled, careful people made one reasoned trade-off against a real hazard, and the trade-off cost a life. That's a less satisfying lesson than don't be reckless. It's also the more accurate one. Little Cottonwood Canyon's granite walls, distinct from the sandstone that shapes most of this list, were carved by glaciers during the last ice age rather than flash floods, leaving the deep U-shaped profile visible from the canyon road today. A very different geologic story from the slot canyons further south. That difference matters for how climbers read risk here. Sandstone forgives certain mistakes and punishes others, prone to sudden rock fall from a formation still actively eroding underfoot and overhead. Granite is a harder, more stable rock overall, which shifts the dominant hazard away from the stone itself, here, and toward the systems climbers bring with them: ropes, anchors, and the discipline required to manage them correctly on every single pitch. There's a reason experienced Wasatch climbers talk about the Great White Icicle with a specific kind of respect that newer routes rarely earn. It's been climbed and descended thousands of times without major incident, which builds exactly the kind of quiet familiarity that can make a deliberate shortcut, skipping a stopper knot to protect water flow, feel like reasonable local knowledge rather than a genuine trade of one risk for another. Familiarity with a route isn't the same thing as immunity from what the route can still do, and this incident is the clearest example on this entire list of how thin that particular line actually is. Utah's climbing community is small enough, relative to somewhere like Colorado's Front Range, that an incident on a well-known route like the Great White Icicle tends to circulate quickly through word-of-mouth, gyms, and online forums well before any official report is published, and that informal network arguably does as much to spread lessons like this one as any agency statement. Climbers who never met the two people involved in this accident still know the story, still know exactly which rappel station it happened at, and still, when they rig their own descent on that same route, feel the specific, learned pull to tie the knot anyway. Eighth is Chop Rock Canyon, deep in the Escalante system, and this is the entry on this list that best explains why some canyoneers fear a feature that isn't a flood, a fall, or a rock at all. In April of 2005, two Brigham Young University students, John Anderson and Brad Underwood, days from graduation, entered the canyon together. They didn't come out. Search crews spent almost 4 days working through the canyon before finding both bodies in a pool of water roughly 10 to 15 feet deep, in a section of the slot narrow enough in places to measure 16 inches across. The working explanation based on the site and the conditions was hypothermia. Prolonged immersion in cold water they had no adequate protection against, in a spot they could not climb back out of on their own. What killed them has a name in the canyoneering world, a keeper pothole, and it's worth understanding exactly why the name fits. Flowing water over centuries drills these features into slick rock at the base of drops, carving smooth, rounded pits that hold standing water long after any flood has passed. The same smoothness that makes them look almost sculpted is what makes them a trap. Walls worn glassy by millennia of water offer no hand or foot purchase, and a pothole deep enough that a person can't touch bottom while treading water becomes, for practical purposes, a vertical walled tank with no ladder. Canyoneers carry specific gear for exactly this scenario now: aid climbing hooks on extendable poles, weighted throw bags rigged to loop over the pothole's lip so a stranded person has something to climb, precisely because the terrain gives no natural way out on its own. In the years since 2005, that gear, along with route guides that flag known keeper potholes by name, has become close to standard equipment for anyone descending a technical canyon in this region. It didn't exist as common practice before incidents like this one made the case for it. Anderson and Underwood were days from finishing their degrees, a detail that shows up in nearly every account of this incident, and it's there for a reason that goes beyond sentiment. It shows how little this canyon cared about anything happening in either of their lives outside its walls. Chop Rock isn't among the more heavily trafficked technical canyons in the Escalante system, and that relative obscurity cuts both ways. Fewer other hikers to notice a party is overdue, fewer cell signals or satellite check-in points along the route, and a rescue response that, even once triggered, faced a canyon complex intricate enough that locating two specific bodies took search teams the better part of 4 days. Route-finding guides for technical canyons in this region now routinely flag known keeper potholes years or even decades in advance of a given hiker's trip, information passed along specifically so nobody has to discover a pothole's true depth the way Anderson and Underwood did. That kind of shared knowledge, built canyon by canyon, often incident by incident, is one of the few defenses that actually works against a hazard with no visible warning sign standing at its edge. The Escalante River drainage, which Chop Rock feeds into, contains dozens of named technical canyons within a single sprawling wilderness complex, more than most visitors realize exist until they start reading route guides in detail And that density is exactly why the region draws serious canyoneers from around the world, while also producing a steady, quiet stream of search and rescue calls most national news coverage never picks up. Keyhole Canyon and Buckskin Gulch became household names, to the extent any slot canyon is a household name, because of the scale of what happened in them. Chop Rock never made national news the way those two did. The two students who died there are no less gone for it. BYU's own outdoor programs, along with several other Utah universities, expanded formal canyoneering safety instruction in the years following this incident, treating it as a case study specifically because the victims were exactly the demographic most likely to underestimate a remote technical canyon: young, athletic, academically successful, and, by most measures available beforehand, entirely capable of the physical demands the route required. Capability was never the variable that failed them. The canyon simply held a feature neither of them had a way to anticipate before they were already standing at its edge. The Escalante's deep, twisting canyons formed largely through a process geologists call antecedent drainage, rivers that established their courses before the surrounding Colorado Plateau finished uplifting, then cut downward fast enough to keep pace with the rising land around them rather than being deflected by it. That's part of why this whole region contains such a dense concentration of narrow, deep slots relative to its surface area. The rivers didn't wander to find the path of least resistance the way water usually does. They carved straight down through rock that was rising to meet them, leaving passages as improbably narrow and improbably deep as Chop Rock's. Seventh is Cataract Canyon, the roughly 14-mile stretch of the Colorado River inside Canyonlands National Park, where the river drops through a series of rapids collectively rated among the most difficult, commercially run whitewater in the country. On May 17, 1995, a raft carrying a boatman and a 41-year-old passenger struck a rock in Big Drop 2. The impact threw both men into the river. The boatman swam clear and reached shore. The passenger, according to the Park Service's own incident report, made no apparent effort to extricate himself from the water and was found downstream near Imperial Canyon, where a physician on a nearby trip administered CPR before pronouncing him dead. That detail, no apparent effort to extricate himself, is a clinical way of describing something rafting guides on this stretch know by a blunter term: cold shock and swim failure. Water in Cataract Canyon, fed largely by snowmelt, regularly sits cold enough in spring to trigger an involuntary gasp reflex on sudden immersion, followed within minutes by a sharp loss of muscle coordination in the arms and legs, well before core body temperature has dropped enough to cause hypothermia on its own. A strong swimmer in a warm pool and the same swimmer thrown into 40-something degree whitewater are, physiologically, not the same person for the first several minutes. The hydraulics inside a Class 4 rapid compound the problem. Aerated water at the base of a big drop is far less buoyant than flat water. And that's why a personal flotation device that would keep a person's head up in a lake can still leave them submerged inside the foam of a major hole. Commercial outfitters on this stretch of the Colorado now run mandatory safety briefings and swim tests specifically built around this window of impaired swimming ability, not general water safety, a distinction this incident and others like it on the same rapids helped establish. Big Drop 2 and Big Drop 3 sit within a stretch commercial guides simply call the Big Drops, 3 consecutive rapids that drop the Colorado River roughly 30 feet in under half a mile, generated by a debris fan rather than a waterfall, where a side canyon has, over geologic time, dumped enough boulders into the main channel to choke the river into a narrow, violent chute. The specific hydraulic that claimed the passenger in this incident, a hole formed where water pours over a submerged rock and curls back on itself, can hold a swimmer or even an entire raft in a recirculating cycle far longer than most people expect, cycling a body downward, back to the surface, and downward again rather than releasing it downstream the way flat water would. Cataract Canyon's difficulty rating shifts dramatically with the river's flow level, and that level is controlled upstream by dam releases and snowmelt timing, not by anything happening locally in the canyon that day. A rapid that's a moderate, forgiving run in low water can turn into one of the most hazardous stretches of commercially rafted whitewater in North America within the same season, sometimes the same week, depending on decisions made at a reservoir hundreds of miles away. Cataract Canyon sits downstream of the confluence where the Green and Colorado rivers meet, doubling the water volume moving through the canyon almost instantly at that junction. And that surge is why the rapids here build to a scale the upper Colorado simply doesn't produce. Commercial trips through the big drops now carry safety kayakers positioned specifically to assist swimmers thrown from rafts, a practice that became standard well after this 1995 incident, developed in direct response to a documented pattern of exactly this kind of ejection and drowning event across multiple trips over the years. This one among the earliest and most frequently cited. This list also treats a commercial rafting trip differently from an independent backcountry hike, because the risk calculus is different. A permitted outfitter running Cataract Canyon carries trained guides, safety kayakers, and standardized swim test protocols built from decades of accumulated incident data. Exactly the kind of institutional memory a solo hiker or a small, independent party in a remote slot canyon almost never has access to. That infrastructure doesn't make the river safe in any absolute sense. Big Drop 2 remains hazardous water at high flow, but it does mean an incident like this one becomes a lesson the entire industry absorbs and builds around, rather than a private tragedy that changes nothing for the next group through. Independent, unguided river trips through Cataract Canyon remain legal and popular among experienced private boaters. Permit demand for self-guided launches consistently outstrips availability most seasons. That population carries a meaningfully different risk profile than a commercial trip does, without mandatory guide training, without a safety kayaker stationed below a known hazard, often without the same depth of local knowledge about which line through Big Drop 2 actually avoids the worst of the hydraulics at a given flow. The river doesn't check permits before deciding how hard to hit a raft. It only ever checks the flow gauge. Sixth is Heaps Canyon, inside Zion National Park, widely regarded by canyoneers as one of the most demanding technical descents in the park. And this entry centers on getting the sequence of the exit wrong, rather than any single piece of equipment failing. On November 27, 2021, 31-year-old Andrew Arvig, part of a permitted three-person group, was working through the canyon's final rappels above Upper Emerald Pools. Somewhere in that sequence, he rappelled past a small rock ledge where the route required him to stop and re-anchor before continuing. He couldn't climb back up to it. Left hanging on the rope roughly 260 feet above the pools, unable to reach either the ledge above or solid ground below, he was stranded in place. More than 30 rescuers and multiple helicopters responded. He was lowered from the rope, but he was pronounced deceased. Heaps Canyon isn't a beginner's route. And Arvig's group wasn't a beginner's group. They held a permit, which the park requires specifically to filter out parties without the experience the descent demands. What this incident exposes isn't a lack of skill, so much as how unforgiving a multi-stage rappel sequence is to a single missed cue. A canyon exit like this one is built from a chain of small, sequential decisions: rope length, stopping point, anchor placement, each one dependent on getting the one before it exactly right. And a route that has no room for error compounds a small miss into a position with no good options in either direction. This wasn't the first fatality on this specific exit sequence either. A separate, unroped fall in the same canyon in 2015 killed a 24-year-old hiker on a different section of the same descent. Two different mistakes, 6 years apart, on the same technical exit is the kind of pattern that tells rangers something about the terrain itself, not just about the people who died on it. Zion issues a limited number of permits for Heeps Canyon each day, fewer than for most of the park's other technical routes, a restriction that reflects how seriously the park treats the descent's difficulty rather than any attempt to make the canyon feel more exclusive. The route demands multiple rappels exceeding 100 feet, at least one of which requires a mid-descent transition from one rope system to another while hanging in open air, a maneuver that leaves almost no margin for a missed cue partway through. Permit applicants are required to demonstrate prior technical canyoneering experience, specifically because the park's own rangers concluded, after incidents like Arvig's, that route difficulty alone wasn't sufficient information for a group to accurately judge whether they were ready. What distinguishes Heeps from a climbing route with a comparable difficulty rating is the one-way nature of the descent. A climber who feels overextended partway up a wall generally has the option to downclimb or be lowered back to easier ground. A canyoneer partway through Heeps' exit sequence, hanging above a 200-foot drop with a missed anchor point above and unknown ground below, often has no equivalent retreat. The canyon doesn't offer a version of turning back once the final rappels begin. I find it worth stating directly that a permit system, a difficulty rating, and a prior experience requirement, all three of which Zion had in place for Heeps Canyon well before 2021, still weren't enough to prevent this death. And that isn't a criticism of the park's process so much as an honest limit on what any process can guarantee. Permits filter out unprepared parties. They cannot filter out the single missed handhold, the one misjudged ledge, the split second a well-prepared climber's attention goes somewhere other than exactly where it needed to be. Some of the risk here is simply the residue left over after the system has already done everything it reasonably can, not a gap in the system at all. I keep returning to the phrase Zion's own release used to describe Arvig's group, well prepared, very experienced, because it's the phrase that should worry a careful viewer more than any account of a reckless mistake would. A story about carelessness comes with an obvious lesson: be less careless. A story about a well-prepared, experienced party still losing someone on a route they'd trained specifically for offers no equivalent fix. Only a harder, more honest acknowledgement that some irreducible risk survives every reasonable precaution a person can take, and Heeps Canyon has claimed lives from both ends of the experience spectrum to prove it. Both fatal incidents in this canyon happened during the exit sequence, rather than earlier in the descent, a detail rescue coordinators have flagged as a pattern worth naming directly. Fatigue and a sense of the hardest technical work being behind them can erode a party's attentiveness right at the exact point the route still demands its most careful footing and rope management. The canyon doesn't get easier near the end. It only feels that way, and that feeling appears to have played some role in both deaths, 6 years and 2 very different sets of circumstances apart. Fifth is the subway, formerly the left fork of North Creek, one of the most requested permits in Zion National Park and, on the surface, one of its more approachable technical routes. On September 18, 2012, 74-year-old Yoshio Hosobuchi was descending the canyon's final rappel into the waterfall that drops toward the subway's namesake tunnel-shaped chamber, with his wife. His rappel device jammed on the way down. In the attempt to free himself, he cut his own harness, which left him tangled by the foot and suspended upside down over the drop. His wife couldn't reach him or climb back to get help on her own. Another party descending behind them eventually found the two and raised the alarm. Rangers reached Hosobuchi the following day. He had died overnight, and investigators attributed the cause to a combination of exposure and positional asphyxia, the specific, well-documented danger of hanging inverted for an extended period, in which blood pools in the upper body and chest, and the diaphragm struggles against gravity to keep drawing breath. The Park Service's own statement afterward noted that this was the first fatality in the subway in roughly a decade, a fact that matters here, because it means the route had built a reputation, largely deserved, as one of the gentler introductions to technical canyoneering in the park. That reputation is precisely what makes a jam device on the final rappel so dangerous. A route people approach with their guard partly down offers little margin when a single mechanical failure occurs at the one point in the descent with no simple backup, dangling over a plunge pool, alone, but for one partner who cannot physically reach the person in trouble. Positional asphyxia doesn't require a long drop or a dramatic accident. It requires time upside down and nobody able to right the body before the body's own physiology turns against it. The subway's namesake feature, the smooth, tunnel-like chamber near the canyon's exit, was carved by the same erosional process that shapes every slot on this list, water finding the path of least resistance through Navajo sandstone over tens of thousands of years, cutting a rounded, almost architectural passage that draws photographers from around the world. That beauty and the final rappel's danger share the same cause. The chamber is smooth because water has scoured it clean for millennia, and the drop at its edge exists precisely because that same water carved downward, faster than it carved outward, leaving a final plunge with no gradual, walkable transition, only the rappel. Hosobuchi's age is a detail worth confronting directly rather than skating past. Canyoneering skews toward a physically demanding, gear-intensive style of outdoor recreation, and there's a common assumption that its risks concentrate among younger, more aggressive practitioners taking bigger chances. A 74-year-old on a route the park itself describes as one of its gentler technical introductions complicates that assumption considerably. Age didn't cause the device jam, but it's a fair question. One Zion's own safety materials now raise more directly than they once did. Whether recovery options after an unexpected jam, the physical strength and flexibility needed to free a stuck device single-handedly while hanging in a harness should factor into how a hiker of any age evaluates a route build as approachable. Rappel devices are engineered specifically to create controlled friction against a rope, and a jam typically means that friction has locked up entirely, rather than failed to hold, an important distinction. The device didn't fail Hosobuchi in the sense of releasing him to fall. It failed by refusing to move at all, leaving him stopped mid-descent with no working method to continue down or climb back up. Canyoneering instructors teach specific backup techniques for exactly this failure mode: ascending the rope using mechanical grips, transferring weight to a secondary line. Precisely so, a jam becomes an inconvenience rather than the start of an emergency. Those techniques require both hands, functioning gear, and enough space to work, three things considerably harder to guarantee while inverted above a waterfall than while practicing calmly on dry ground. Zion permits roughly 200 canyoneering trips into the subway on any given day it's open, split between the more strenuous bottom-up hike and the technical top-down descent Hosobuchi and his wife were completing, making it, by volume, one of the busiest technical routes in the American canyoneering world. A single fatality in a decade against that kind of visitation, statistically, describes a route that behaves safely for the overwhelming majority of people who attempt it. It's a fact that offers no comfort at all to the one family for whom the exception became the whole story. And this list exists partly to make sure that exception doesn't quietly disappear inside a reassuring statistic. Positional asphyxia shows up in emergency medicine literature far more often in contexts that have nothing to do with canyoneering, restraint situations, industrial accidents, certain sleeping positions in infants, and that unfamiliarity is exactly why it's such an under-recognized risk in a recreational ropework context. A canyoneer training for a jam device tends to rehearse the mechanical fix, freeing the rope, switching systems, and rehearses it far less often against the clock of how long the body can tolerate being inverted while that fix is attempted. Hosobuchi's death pushed some canyoneering education programs to fold basic positional asphyxia awareness directly into their curriculum, built in as a timed constraint on the mechanical training itself, rather than left as an afterthought. Fourth is the Zion Narrows, the 16-mile top-down permitted hike through the Virgin River Gorge, that is, by a wide margin, the single most iconic canyon route in the state. And this incident is a reminder that iconic and safe are not the same word. On the night of November 22nd, 2022, a married couple, a 31-year-old woman, and 33-year-old man were partway through the permitted overnight route when conditions turned against them. Overnight air temperatures dropped to around 14 degrees Fahrenheit. And the Virgin River itself, which hikers wade and sometimes swim through repeatedly along the route, fell to roughly 38 degrees. Both of them developed hypothermia. The following morning, the husband hiked out alone to find help, flagging down other hikers and a shuttle driver. Rangers located his wife unresponsive near the river. Bystanders performing CPR could not revive her. The Narrows draws roughly the same crowd year-round. Families, first-time backpackers, hikers, checking a bucket list trail off their list. And that consistency of crowd is part of the danger because the canyon itself is not consistent at all. Air temperature in a deep, narrow gorge can swing more than 40 degrees between a warm afternoon and the small hours of the following morning. And river water, fed by runoff and shaded most of the day by walls that block direct sun for hours at a stretch, stays cold well into a season that feels, at the trailhead, like summer. A permit for the overnight route requires proof of proper gear, but proof of ownership isn't the same as proof of use, and a couple who started the hike in comfortable conditions can find themselves, by hour 18 or 20, making decisions with a level of judgment that cold has already begun to erode. Exactly the condition that turns a survivable night into the one this couple didn't both survive. The Narrows permit system requires hikers to certify they're carrying specific cold weather and water gear before issuing an overnight pass. Dry bags, insulating layers rated for near-freezing conditions, a way to start a fire or heat water if needed, and rangers do spot-check gear at the trailhead. What that system can't verify is how a hiker's body responds to 16 hours of intermittent cold water immersion on top of physical exertion, a combination that drains core temperature in a way dryland cold simply doesn't. A jacket rated for freezing air temperatures assumes the wearer is dry underneath it. A hiker who has waded chest-deep water repeatedly throughout the day arrives at nightfall already partway toward hypothermia, before the coldest hours have even begun, wearing gear that was, on paper, adequate for the conditions. River flow through the Narrows is itself managed to reduce risk, closed entirely above certain cubic feet per second thresholds, specifically because higher flows increase both the physical difficulty of wading and the rate of heat loss from repeated immersion. The gorge was open the day this couple began their hike. Flow within the range the park considers acceptable. The danger that found them wasn't a rule the park failed to enforce. It was the ordinary, permitted version of the hike, run 1 degree colder overnight than their gear and their bodies could fully absorb. Roughly 16 miles of the Virgin River carved this gorge through Navajo sandstone over the last several million years, walls in places rising 1,000 feet on either side while the passage between them narrows to barely 20 or 30 feet across, a ratio of height to width that makes the Narrows one of the most visually dramatic hikes in the American West, and, not coincidentally, one of the most photographed. Photographs of a canyon in warm afternoon light convey almost nothing about what the same water and the same walls feel like 8 hours after sunset. And that gap between the version of the Narrows most people see online and the version that exists at 2 in the morning in November is, quietly, one of the most persistent sources of miscalculated risk on this entire list. Zion caps overnight. Narrows permits at a modest number of parties per night specifically to preserve the option of a straightforward evacuation if conditions turn, a limit that exists because the canyon offers vanishingly few exit points along its full 16-mile length, most of them steep, technical scrambles up side canyons that a hypothermic hiker in the dark has little realistic chance of using safely. That scarcity of exits is the same structural problem Buckskin Gulch presents in a different form, a beautiful, narrow corridor that, once entered, commits a hiker to finishing the route largely on the canyon's own terms rather than their own. Rangers stationed at the Narrows trailhead now ask hikers directly, verbally, not just via a checklist, whether they've checked the overnight low forecast specifically, rather than only the daytime high most visitors think to look up before a hike. It's a small conversational shift, one extra question at a permit desk, built entirely around the recognition that a hiker who feels adequately prepared for a warm afternoon can still be walking straight into a night colder than anything they planned their gear around, simply because nobody prompted them to check that specific number before they left the trailhead. Third is Blue John Canyon, in the remote country south of the Roost, and this is very likely the most famous entry on this entire list, though most people who know the story couldn't point to the canyon on a map. On April 26, 2003, 27-year-old Aaron Ralston, canyoneering alone and without telling anyone his planned route, was descending a narrow slot when an 800-pound sandstone boulder he was climbing past shifted and pinned his right forearm against the canyon wall. He spent the next 5 days trapped in that position, rationing a small amount of water and food, before making the decision that would define the rest of his life. He broke the bones of his own forearm, then used a dull multi-tool knife to sever the arm below the elbow. He rappelled one-handed to the canyon floor, hiked several miles, and was found by a family of hikers who alerted authorities. Ralston hadn't told anyone where he was going, which is the detail search and rescue coordinators return to most often when this incident comes up, because it turned a survivable accident into a near-death one, almost entirely on its own. A boulder shift like this, an unstable rock that has looked stable for years suddenly settling under new weight, isn't a freak occurrence in canyon country. Sandstone chalkstones wedge into slot canyons precisely because those slots are still actively eroding, and a rock that has sat undisturbed since the last flood moved it into place can shift the moment a climber's body weight changes the load on it in a new direction. What made Blue John different from an ordinary version of that same event wasn't the boulder. It was the absence of anyone who knew where to start looking. Utah's search and rescue coordinators cite this incident constantly, more for the plan Ralston hadn't left behind than for the amputation itself. And it's part of why nearly every backcountry permit issued in the state today asks explicitly for a planned route and an expected return time. Ralston's own account, told at length in his memoir and later dramatized on film, describes the specific mechanics of the boulder shift in enough detail that canyoneering instructors still reference it directly. The rock had likely been resting in that position for a considerable time, wedged just loosely enough that the added shifting weight of a climbing body finally exceeded the friction holding it in place. Chalkstones like it exist throughout Utah's slot canyons precisely because these passages are still actively forming, flash floods depositing boulders that lodge against narrowing walls and stay there, sometimes for years, sometimes for centuries, until either erosion or a climber's weight moves them again. What often gets lost in the retelling, because the ending is so dramatic, is how ordinary the 5 days in between actually were, in the grimmest possible sense. No rescue arriving, no signal reaching anyone, just a slow, deliberate accounting of dwindling water and food against a body that wasn't getting free on its own. Ralston has spent much of his life since as a vocal advocate for exactly the kind of trip planning that could have shortened that wait dramatically. Not because the boulder was avoidable, but because being found sooner might have meant not needing to make the choice he ultimately made at all. Blue John Canyon sits within the broader Robbers Roost country, terrain notorious a century earlier for sheltering outlaws precisely because its maze of canyons made pursuit nearly impossible. A history that has nothing directly to do with what happened to Ralston and everything to do with why the area remains as remote and lightly traveled as it is today. Cell coverage across most of this region is effectively non-existent even now, decades after Ralston's accident, and satellite messengers, while increasingly common among serious canyoneers, still aren't universal equipment. The specific brand of isolation that turned a shifted boulder into a 5-day ordeal hasn't gone anywhere. What's changed is how many hikers now enter that isolation, having told somebody, in writing, exactly where they went. Ralston returned to canyoneering after his recovery, a decision that surprises people who only know the amputation, and it says something real about how experienced canyoneers actually relate to risk after surviving its worst version. He didn't conclude the activity itself was the problem. He concluded the specific failure, entering remote terrain alone with nobody aware of his route or return time, was the problem. And that distinction between the activity and the specific unmanaged risk inside it runs through nearly every safety reform that's followed any incident on this entire list, from Zion's flash flood ratings to Kane County's trailhead test posts. Nobody involved in managing these canyons wants to close them. They want the next version of this exact mistake to be survivable. The image most people carry of this story, the amputation itself, is also the part that tends to crowd out everything more useful about it. Ralston's actual survival depended on a long chain of separate decisions made under extreme duress. Rationing water precisely, conserving energy, finding the physical and psychological resolve to injure himself deliberately after 5 days of hoping rescue would arrive instead, then navigating and rappelling one-handed out of a canyon most people would struggle to exit at full strength. The single dramatic act everyone remembers was the last link in a chain, not the whole of what kept him alive long enough to need it. Second is Buckskin Gulch, a tributary of the Paria River that runs continuously narrow, in places under 10 feet wide and up to 400 feet deep, for roughly 15 unbroken miles, making it the longest technical slot canyon in the country. On March 16, 2023, 3 hikers, Ed Smith, Jeff Watson, and Bill Romaniello, set out on a multi-day route through the gulch. An atmospheric river storm system moved through the region that weekend, and floodwater poured into the canyon. Smith survived, badly hypothermic, and was later able to tell rescuers that the group had been hit by a flash flood and swept downstream. Watson and Romaniello did not survive. Their bodies were recovered separately over the following days. What sets Buckskin Gulch apart from an ordinary flash flood risk is the canyon's own geometry, not the storm itself. Most slot canyons offer a hiker occasional high ground, a ledge, a side passage, a spot to climb above rising water even briefly. Buckskin Gulch, for stretches of several continuous miles, offers essentially none. Sheer walls on both sides, a floor that is the only usable ground, and no realistic way to climb out until the canyon widens again, however far downstream that happens to be. A flood that would be survivable, even manageable, in a canyon with regular escape points becomes close to inescapable here, purely because of how the rock is shaped. That length is exactly what draws experienced hikers to the route in the first place. The chance to walk 15 miles inside a passage barely wider than a hallway. And it's the same length that removes the option every other canyon on this list still offers in some form. Get above the water before it's too late. The storm system behind this flood was itself unusual. An atmospheric river, a long, narrow band of concentrated moisture stretching across the Pacific and funneling directly into the southwest, capable of dropping far more rain over a wider area than a typical isolated summer thunderstorm cell. That distinction matters for how hikers assess risk before entering a canyon like this one. A localized monsoon cell might threaten one drainage while leaving a neighboring canyon untouched, which is part of why some hikers develop a false sense that watching the immediate sky is sufficient information. An atmospheric river event saturates an entire region at once, raising water levels across multiple interconnected drainages simultaneously, which is exactly what turned Buckskin Gulch and the broader Paria system into a hazard along its full length that weekend, not just at one isolated pinch point. 11 other hikers were pulled from the same flooded system that week by helicopter, a detail that tends to get overshadowed by the two fatalities, but says something important on its own. This wasn't one unlucky group caught by a freak, isolated event. It was one weather system moving through a canyon network built almost entirely without escape routes, testing every party inside it at the same time. And the outcomes for those different parties came down to position in the canyon, timing, and how quickly each group could reach whatever high ground existed near them, more than to any difference in skill or preparation between the hikers who survived and the two who didn't. Kane County's Sheriff's Office, which coordinates most search and rescue response for this stretch of the Paria system, has pushed in the years since for wider adoption of real-time gauge data and satellite-based storm tracking, covering the watershed that feeds Buckskin Gulch specifically. Had that information existed in a form accessible to hikers checking conditions that March morning, it might have flagged the atmospheric river's approach clearly enough to delay the trip. That infrastructure has improved. It hasn't solved the deeper problem the canyon's own shape creates, which no forecast, however accurate, changes. Once you're 15 miles into a corridor with no exit, the best information in the world only tells you how much time you have left to find one. Ed Smith's survival, badly hypothermic but alive, deserves a beat of its own here, because his account is the closest thing this list has to a first-hand description of the moment the water actually arrived, a wall of it, without the gradual rise a hiker might picture, catching all three of them essentially at once and carrying them downstream through darkness and cold. Before he was able to reach ground, the other two couldn't. Survivor accounts like his have become valuable data for the agencies studying these floods, filling in the texture that a gauge reading or a recovered body alone can't provide. A sense of how fast the transition from ordinary hike to life-threatening emergency actually feels from inside it. Buckskin Gulch and Paria Canyon together form a single connected wilderness permit area, managed jointly by the Bureau of Land Management and the National Park Service. An administrative arrangement that reflects a simple hydrological fact. Water entering anywhere in this drainage eventually funnels through the same narrow corridors, regardless of which agency's boundary line it happens to cross on a map. Storm warnings and permit restrictions here are issued for the whole system at once, rather than canyon by canyon, because a flood risk assessment that stopped at an administrative border would be describing the paperwork, not the water. Which brings this list to its top spot, Keyhole Canyon, a short technical route inside Zion National Park that most groups complete in under 3 hours. On September 14, 2015, 7 canyoneers, Mark McKenzie, Linda Arthur, Steve Arthur, Gary Favela, Don Teichner, Muku Reynolds, and Robin Broom, pulled a permit that morning and entered the canyon in clear weather. A thunderstorm cell developed that afternoon, miles from their position, dropping roughly 2/3 of an inch of rain in about an hour over a drainage that fed directly into the slot below them. Stream flow at the canyon's gauge spiked from 55 cubic feet per second to over 2,600 in about 15 minutes. All 7 of them died. Recovery took Park Service crews multiple days and more than 60 searchers. Keyhole earns the top of this list not because the flood itself was unusual for Slot Canyon country. Floods like it happen every monsoon season, but because of exactly how little warning existed at the point in the canyon where the group was working through their rappels. The storm that caused this flood never passed directly overhead. it didn't need to. Water falling on a drainage basin miles away funnels through the same narrow channel a canyoneer is standing in, arriving with almost no local sign, no darkening sky, no distant thunder loud enough to register as a threat. Sometimes no rain at all where the hikers themselves are standing. By the time floodwater is visible inside a slot this narrow, the volume has typically already reached a scale no group can outrun on foot, let alone while managing ropes on a technical rappel. This incident, more than any other single event, is why Zion's permit system now includes real-time flash flood potential ratings tied to distant weather forecasts rather than conditions at the trailhead, and why every ranger briefing for a technical slot canyon in this state now opens with some version of the same warning. The sky above you is not the sky that decides whether you live through the day. The 7 who died that day ranged in age from 51 to 59, an experienced group by most measures, several of them long-time hikers who had completed technical canyons before. Zion's after-action review of the incident didn't attribute the deaths to inexperience or a specific error in judgment at any single decision point. The group had pulled a legitimate permit, checked conditions available to them that morning, and entered a canyon that, by every piece of information accessible to them at the trailhead, looked safe. What the review changed instead was the information available before that decision gets made at all. The park's flash flood potential rating, introduced in the years following this incident, now factors in radar data and forecasts from a wider geographic area than a hiker standing at a trailhead could ever assess alone, converting a judgment call that used to rely on visible sky conditions into one informed by weather, happening well outside anyone's field of view. Every other canyon on this list eventually reveals its danger clearly enough, in hindsight, that you can trace the exact moment a different choice might have changed the outcome. A stopper knot, a satellite beacon triggered an hour earlier, a route not taken alone. Keyhole Canyon resists that kind of clean accounting, and that resistance is exactly why it sits at the top of this list. 7 experienced people did very little that a careful outside observer would flag as a mistake, and the canyon killed all 7 of them anyway, because the actual danger was never visible from where they stood. Recovery operations after the flood stretched across multiple days and drew on more than 60 personnel from local, state, and federal agencies, working through debris fields and pooled water in a canyon that, under normal conditions, most groups clear in well under 3 hours. That mismatch, 3 hours to descend, days to recover the people who never made it out, says something about the sheer force involved that the flow numbers alone don't fully convey. 55 cubic feet per second is a manageable trickle. 2,600 is closer to the discharge of a moderate river, arriving inside a corridor never built to carry it, against 7 people who had every reason, based on everything visible to them that morning, to believe the day ahead was an easy one. Keyhole Canyon reopened to permits after the required review, which surprises some people the first time they hear it, given how the story ends. It's a reasonable enough reaction, and also, I think, the wrong one. The canyon didn't do anything unprecedented that afternoon. Slot canyons flood, that's the same erosional process that carved every passage on this list in the first place. And closing every canyon capable of flooding would mean closing all of them. What changed wasn't the canyon. It was the quality of the information a hiker now has access to before deciding whether that day's particular storm risk is one worth taking on. I've walked through 20 canyons now, and I want to be honest that a couple of names on this list, Keyhole, Blue John, the Subway, will already have been familiar to some of you. That's fine. Familiarity was never really the point of ranking them this way. The point was to put a canyon most people have never heard of, Kachina Bridge, Chop Rock, Courthouse Wash, next to the ones everyone already knows, and let the same criterion, how much warning a person actually gets before the mistake becomes permanent, decide where each of them landed rather than letting name recognition do that work instead. Zion's flash flood potential system, built directly in response to this disaster, deserves one more look before this list closes, because it changed something more fundamental than a single park's permit paperwork. Before 2015, the standard advice for judging flood risk in a slot canyon amounted to reading the sky above you and checking a general seasonal forecast, information that, as this canyon proved, tells a hiker almost nothing about a storm cell forming 10 miles upstream in a drainage they can't see. The system built afterward pulls radar and rainfall data from the entire watershed feeding a given canyon, then translates that into a plain rating, low, moderate, considerable, high, posted at the permit station the morning of a hike. Other land management agencies across the Colorado Plateau have since adopted comparable tools for their own slot canyon permits. None of it exists because a committee anticipated the problem in advance. It exists because 7 people did everything a reasonable hiker could be asked to do, and the canyon killed them anyway. And the agencies responsible for that stretch of sandstone decided that wasn't an acceptable place to leave the problem sitting. Look back across these 20 canyons, and a pattern holds that has nothing to do with elevation, remoteness, or how many stars a trail earns online. The canyons near the bottom of this list, the ones that trapped a body in a narrow gap, scalded a hand in a hot pool, or dropped a slab where a hiker could actually see it fall, all left some kind of signal a person standing there could, in principle, have caught in time. The ones that climbed toward the top didn't. A chalkstone that had held its position for years, a rope that measures the same in the hand, whether it's 4 feet too short or 4 feet too long, a storm cell erupting over a drainage nobody at the bottom of the canyon could see, a night that started at a comfortable temperature and finished one that a fit, well-equipped hiker still couldn't survive. None of those 20 people were careless in any way a photograph or a checklist would have caught. They read the terrain the way it presented itself, and the terrain simply wasn't showing them the part that mattered. That's the real map this list leaves you with, and it isn't the one printed at any trailhead kiosk. The official maps of Utah's canyon country mark trail distance, water sources, permit boundaries, elevation gain, all of it useful. None of it showing the one variable that actually separated survival from tragedy in most of these 20 stories. How much runway existed between the mistake and the moment it became unrecoverable? Some canyons hand you that runway generously. A few hand you almost none at all. And from the trailhead, dressed in the same golden sandstone, under the same wide desert sky, there is no way to tell which kind you're standing in front of until you're already inside it. If one of these 20 stuck with you more than the others, say which one and why in the comments, whether it's the highest body count, or one like Kachina Bridge or Weeping Rock, where nobody did anything wrong and the danger showed up anyway. I'd also like to know if this changes which of these you'd still hike. A like keeps this kind of ranking coming, and subscribing means you won't miss whichever canyon gets investigated next.